Hi everyone, my name is Blaire Morseau. I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Religious Studies. I also teach courses in American Indian and Indigenous Studies. I'm a citizen of the Pokagon band Potawatomi, which is one of 12 federally recognized tribes here in the state of Michigan. I currently reside in East Lansing. And my research interests are in Indigenous science fiction and futurisms, but because I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, a lot of the methods that I use are interview-based. I implement archival practices as well, depending on the project. So I'm excited to be here virtually with you talking about my latest book project, which is an edited collection on Simon Pokagon's Birch bark books. And as part of the larger project, of course, it includes the publication, but also the Mellon-funded audio recordings we did to kind of bring new life to these stories, much of which is in the Potawatomi language. So we thought that an audio component to this project would help make the stories more accessible both to our community as well as non-native communities. So just to backtrack a little bit, I was working as my tribe's first archivist, or at least the first full-time archivist, back in 2017. Of course, 2020 disrupted some things, so there were some changes then. And these birch bark books that I'll be talking about come from the Douglas Fisher collection. That was the person who sold the birch bark books to the tribe, as well as several other materials related to Simon Pokagon's work. And this was acquired and accessioned into the collection just shortly before I started working for the tribe. And just to give you a little sense of our Department of Language and Culture, here are some images of me in the archives room holding something that's not the birch bark book, something else, as well as some of the programming we've done in the past, some of which includes an archives open house night to reacquaint tribal members with some of our heritage and our material culture that's housed in the Department of Language and Culture. And so in 2018, I was invited to give a lecture at the Michigan History Conference, and I presented on the birch bark books there. And the then editor-in-chief asked if I would be interested in possibly republishing what's contained within the birch bark books in some sort of future book project. Of course I was, but it took quite a bit of time to really get the project launched. And so ultimately I ended up working with Michigan State University Press in order to release this volume. And so if you've never seen the birch bark books, or perhaps this is your first time ever hearing that there are some Potawatomi stories somewhere printed on birch bark from the white birch tree, this is what some of them look like, the ones that are held in our collection at least. And if you have heard of Simon Pokagon's books, likely you've heard of the one in the right-hand corner, The Red Man's Rebuke. It's also been published under an alternative title, The Red Man's Greeting, which was published in 1893, mostly in English. There are only 2 Potawatomi words in this sort of manifesto of sorts, which happen to be God and the devil, which is interesting. But these 3 other titles, which were published posthumously about 2 years or a year and a half after Simon passed away, include Algonquian Legends of Paw Paw Lake, Potawatomi Book of Genesis, and Algonquian Legends of South Haven. So you see at least 2 of these titles point to specific Indigenous stories related to places in Michigan. And then this Potawatomi Book of Genesis is exactly what it sounds like. It's a creation story. And like I mentioned, these were published after Simon's death by his attorney, which was Phineas H. angle. He also assisted Simon in publishing the Red Man's Rebuke as well. So a little bit about Pokagon. As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. You may have heard of that tribe being one of the 12 federally recognized tribes in the state of Michigan. And our tribe is named after Leopold Pokagon here in the left, upper left, principally because of his leadership for the communities of which we are descendants. He also advocated for his villages in the Treaty of Chicago, which essentially allowed us to avoid being removed to Kansas or Oklahoma like the other bands of Potawatomis who are there now, including the Prairie Band in Kansas and the Citizen Band in Oklahoma. So it's a much longer history, but that's largely why we're called Pokagon Band Potawatomi today. But Pokagon wasn't always referred to as that. His original name, as far as we know, was Saquonic. And it's not uncommon, especially at this time, to obtain different names later on in life as you perform certain deeds, as you participate in certain ceremonies, or you accomplish certain things. And so Pokagon has a couple of different stories about where this name came from, but it does mean rib in English. Some people say that he wore a sort of rib in his hair, so people started referring to him as that. Other folks take rib to mean as a sort of metaphor for what our ribs do to protect our internal organs, or Pokagon or rib protected his people. Now he was known to be Ojibwe, actually, not Potawatomi, but he was adopted by Chief Topnabi and later married Topnabi's daughter, who was Katese. And Topnabi is an anglicized version of what we would say in Potawatomi as Dokmabe, or he or she sits quietly. And as you might see with this little asterisk here, unfortunately, I have never been able to find a picture of Katese, but instead using a sketch from George Winter, who was someone in the 1837 who hung out with some Potawatomi folks, principally in Indiana, and sketched their likeness. So he marries Katese, has several children, one of whom is Simon Pokagon. And what's interesting about this time as well is this is where you can start to see how naming conventions are changing from the sort of singular individual name that you might have, which of course could be inspired by an ancestor or your clan relations, but it wasn't just a given that you would receive the surname from your father or even your mother, except when we get to this point. So baptized strategically in order to stay in their homelands, as well as take on these anglicized surnames. You see Pokagon become Leopold Pokagon, and Katese become Elizabeth Topnabi, taking on, of course, the name of her father as her new surname. And then the children of this married couple all become Pokagon. Okay. So Simon Pokagon was, of course, an author, advocate, but you should know that he's kind of a controversial figure within the Potawatomi community, partly because they saw him as sort of a showboat, or stretching his reach beyond what he was given the right to do, or making agreements that he wasn't quite in the position to make. Later on, we have rumors that perhaps he didn't even write some of what is attributed to him. After so many decades and a lot of research, I can safely tell you that he likely did write all of that he published. It's possible in some cases that he had a sort of heavy-handed editor, and I'll talk a little bit about why we think that in a bit, because partly it has to do with the errors within the Indigenous language that he uses. But to kind of sum this up, John Lau, who wrote Imprints about Potawatomi connections to the city of Chicago, he says in relation to Simon Pokagon, within our community, he is cast as both hero and villain. So what's significant about birch bark? Why did Simon decide to write this? Now, in the Red Man's Rebuke, he says exactly why he did this. He says that it's paying homage to his people who used it for many different purposes, anything from ceremonial use to lighting council fires. And what he doesn't mention, though, is that also wigwas, what we would call birch bark, was used, in fact, traditionally to tell stories. So within especially Midewin lodges, but certainly other contexts as well, these scrolls of birch bark would have etchings in them in order to assist the orator in retelling a story or a history or a song, something like that. So the fact that Simon would then use more modern tools like a printing press in order to tell newer stories is something that is certainly not by accident. And just to give you a little sense of how this material is harvested, you may have seen white birch trees, especially up north. And if you're careful, you can cut a large section down vertically and kind of shimmy off a thick layer of the birch bark. And from there, you can decide to peel them into smaller or rather thinner layers, depending on what you need it for. Of course, if it's for a canoe, you'd want it to be thicker. If you'd want it for something like paper, like Simon does, you'd want it to be thinner. And this is one of the few trees that is more of a laminate structure so that you can do this. And to give you a sense of some of the other works that we might use more artistically for birch bark, you have in the left a birch bark biting done by Kelly Church. Her artwork is also what's featured on the cover of As Sacred to Us. And this works by folding the birch bark paper into segments similar to the way you'd prepare to fold paper and cut them into snowflakes. And birch bark reacts differently depending on the season in which you harvest it. So if you harvest it in the winter, there are these tannins between the laminate structure of the birch bark, and you can use positive and negative space strategically in order to create really intricate designs like you see here from Biscahone Greg Johnson, where the light bit is the etched part and the dark part is where the tannins still are. So it's sort of like drawing in reverse. And just another item from the Pokagon Band archives is yet another book which may have been used for the tourist trade, sort of turn of the 20th century art market. It was likely sold to a non-native person and features quill work on the cover, floral quill work, which would have been used from porcupine quills that were dyed different colors and then sort of embroidered onto the birch bark cover. And just a real quick overview of the book. If you'd like to learn more, you can certainly buy it. But the contributors include myself for the introduction, co-authoring with Bemedwin Kyle Malat, who is an advanced Potawatomi language specialist and gives us a lot of really great insight into the significance of the form of, I guess you could say, Potawatomi language that Simon uses, because the way he goes about translating what he says is sometimes strategic, sometimes political, and I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that. And then Corinne Casper, who is another Pokagon Potawatomi citizen, is a linguist, and she talks a little bit about the history of Potawatomi language documentation and situates that with what Simon would have been, the sort of language politics that Simon would have been experiencing at that time. And then the geology summary that I co-authored with Nicholas Marcelletti, he had previously done research several decades ago in the region that Simon Pokagon talks about in his Algonquian Legends of Paw Paw Lake. And so when I did some preliminary presentations about Simon's work, we connected and he was interested in sharing some of this information. And so again, I'll talk a little bit about that here in a bit. Dr. Kelly Weiskup at Northwestern, she did some incredible research about the likely ways in which the birch bark was printed on, which is a lot trickier than you would imagine. And then finally, we have conservatives Oa Shablom and Marika Kay, who did their own work with the birch barks and the collections for the institutions that they were working with, because birch bark is not the same as regular paper and presents a unique set of conservative or conservation methods that I think they've really done well to contribute to the literature on. I also must shout out to Fritz Swanson, who was not a contributor to the volume, but I know assisted Kelly Weiskup a lot in the form and method of how these birch bark books may have been printed, because it is a really challenging material. It has a sort of powdery substance on it, which would be really tricky for getting ink to stick onto. And also, I don't know about you all, but often when I think about printing presses, I think about like the 16th century and how they were all literally presses, right? And you're situating the sort of blocks of text, and they're all being individually printed with someone who's, you know, like a waffle iron printing down on the paper. But by the time that these birch bark books were being printed in the 1890s and the early 1900s, printing was a lot more efficient at this point. We have newspapers on these large barrels, and that's probably not the right term, but the sort of printing that was done for the birch bark would have been much more laborious and would have required that people do this hand. Every print was its own sort of press. And so Fritz Swanson did a lot of research on this to try to figure out exactly how it was done. And within his research too, I should note that beyond the men who are printed and given credit for this work, we know that there must have been women, native artists who were going out and harvesting this birch bark, who were likely already in the tourist trade of selling birch bark materials. That was really common at that time, especially as Michigan became more of a tourist destination for folks to summer upon the lakes. And so while at the time printing was very efficient, something that was likely used for local newspapers would include this large cylinder press here on the left, but more than likely was the more antiquated Washington iron hand press that was used for the birch bark books. Now, from a cultural, sort of historical perspective, much of what's in Simon Pokagon's works, in my words, reclaim Indigenous space and place in the Great Lakes region, because many of you are passively speaking Anishinaabe-Moan, which is a sort of umbrella term for the languages spoken by Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe. So when we say things like Chicago, coming from Chicagosh, meaning wild leek, ramp, or onion, which would have been traditionally found there, we are in a way speaking the Indigenous languages of this land. And unfortunately, this image here is so faded, it's difficult to see. But if you pause or zoom in, you can see that there's a meandering river. And on the outskirts of this river are conical like wigwams or teepees. And there are some folks riding canoes in this river, and the caption for this image is "Chicago in My Grandfather's Day" by Chief Pokagon. So he is reminding readers who at this time in 1893 are in Chicago celebrating the modernity of American expansion through things like World's Fairs or the Columbian Exhibition. And so at this time, it's a very jarring juxtaposition between who has been there for tens of thousands of years and who is celebrating the settler colonialism that they are currently participating in. Other places include Nicanong, which he translates as heaven on earth, as well as South Haven being what he refers to as Kachagitagan, or earthly paradise. And if you're kind of a linguist nerd or interested in orthography, of course, at the turn of the 20th century, don't have an established writing system for, I would say, most indigenous languages in North America, Potawatomi included. So there's going to be a lot of differences between how we pronounce and spell things today versus back then. So he hyphenates a lot of the words, and we want to pronounce it kind of slowly, like Kachagitagan, which is a very Ojibwe way of pronouncing something. Potawatomi being known alternatively as a vowel deletion type grammar system, and we say things a lot more clipped and quickly. And so, as I mentioned, Chicago being Chicago, Nicanong meaning beautiful sunset for South Haven, and then Dowagiac, which is the current government headquarters for the Pokagon Potawatomi, stemming from actually Niles, which is close by, being in Dowagiac, or a place of harvesting. The other thing about Algonquian Legends of Paw Paw Lake, which is interesting, is that in the story, when you read it, Simon tells the story of a catastrophic flood that occurs, or rather the sort of opposite of a flood, because when water goes one way, it recedes from another. And so in this area, which I attempted to identify geographically based on his description, we're told that this was the interior of some great bay. And he also mentions that this story, while it's passed down within Potawatomi communities, it doesn't derive from them, that he calls them an ancient group of Anishinaabe. Now, Anishinaabe is an endonym for Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe people. More commonly, Potawatomi folks will call them ourselves Nishnaabe as opposed to Anishinaabe. But anyway, we think that what he was referring to as our Mascoutin people, who we know were driven out of that area by the Odawa sometime before some of the more recent Potawatomi villages were either established or re-established there. So this great interior bay in the lower peninsula of Michigan, he starts to describe in this story how there were thundering and great loud sounds, and the dogs in the village started whining. And Nicholas Marcelletti, who is the geologist who consulted on this and helped write the summary chapter for this story, says, well, wow, that sounds a lot like a sort of what he calls a I can't remember the term, I'm sorry, but this sort of glacial rupture, which was, we're starting to find was quite common at the end of the last ice age. And it's when a sort of bank ruptures and some of the ice that was forming a natural dam for certain interior lakes and bays fails, a flood bank fail, basically, and the water rushes to another part of the continent. It can go hundreds of miles. It's really violent. It tears through a lot of the country, and we can see the evidence of this today. And so that's essentially what happened in the interior of Michigan. And the sort of takeaway to this is that for a long time, Indigenous oral traditions, our stories, were seen as silly or not reliable because they're passed on from generation to generation instead of written down. But there's evidence here that seems to show how reliable some of our oral traditional stories are because they've lasted literally tens of thousands of years. And if you are interested in linguist or native languages, as I've mentioned before, Anishinaabe, which is an endonym for Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe peoples. For our language, we would say Anishinaabe-moin. But if you're talking about more of a Potawatomi dialect, Potawatomi is an anglicized version of Bodewadmi, which is what we would call ourselves. Bodewadmi means people who build a fire, and therefore our language, Bodewadmi Mwen. So in Simon's writing, as I mentioned, he writes predominantly in English. If you're just an English speaker, you can definitely understand it. But he plugs in different Anishinaabe-moen words. So if he's talking about a bear, he might say mukwa instead of bear, but then he'll hyphenate it and put bear in parentheses so you know what it translates to in English. And so part of the criticism of this work from Native peoples in Michigan were that he makes a lot of grammatical errors in the text when he uses this, because if you're familiar with any other languages, you know that there's not always a one-to-one ratio between languages. You can't simply plug in Spanish conjunct in English predominant sentences. Sometimes you can, but a lot of times you can't. It's the relationship between Bodewadmi and English is even further apart. So that's all to say that in his writing, Simon uses Indigenous languages in predominantly English frameworks in ways that our language simply does not work. So what I'm trying to say is that they're not just misspellings or simple mistakes. It seems to be clear that whoever decided to implement what they thought were Potawatomi nouns like bear or fish or lake or sun, were using them in ways that a speaker of this language simply would not do because it doesn't work that way. And so that's sort of part of where the rumor of, well, did Simon even write these kind of came from. And so the other part of this being that as a Potawatomi person, growing up in a Potawatomi village, speaking Potawatomi for most of his life, why does he then decide to use more of an Ojibwe dialect? And that's part of the work of Corinne Casper and why that's so fascinating, because she starts to loosen the threads about language ideologies of that time and showing that because Ojibwe was one of the first Anishinaabe languages transcribed by missionaries and that had dictionaries created, that it probably at that time that Simon was writing would have been seen as a language that was more sophisticated than perhaps the Potawatomi that he was speaking. In the sort of same silly ways that as English speakers we seem to think that French origin words are more sophisticated. There's nothing more sophisticated inherently about them. It's just, language ideology. So lastly, she talks about how his decision to publish stories that include Potawatomi words are ways to assert Potawatomi sovereignty. Because at the time, we weren't federally recognized. We didn't have a whole lot of academic attention paid to folks coming in trying to make dictionaries for us and things like that. So in some ways, part of what he published was a way to attain visibility in ways that simply didn't exist at the time. Last part of this bit comes from some recordings we did of the Birch Bark books. Now, as I mentioned, because these books are written in English and a lot of Anishinaabe words that casual readers might not know how to read or pronounce, we've created audiobook versions of just the short stories, not the entirety of the As Sacred to Us text, all by Pokagon Potawatomi citizens. And this was an effort funded by the Mellon Foundation through the Michigan State University program for less commonly taught languages. And we uploaded these recordings to our online archives website, which I'll show you a screenshot of in a minute here. It's called Wheelquebjigan, which means a bundle or place where sacred items are stored, and that's sort of our front-facing archives program of photos, material culture from our collections, audio, even our dictionary. Bemedjo and Kayomalat has been uploading a lot of dictionary words and phrases, as well as the pronunciations of them. And in order to sort of wrap up here, because this has gone on quite a bit longer than I anticipated, I'll just say that while we're looking toward the past at stories that are tens of thousands of years old, specifically birch bark books that were published over 120 years ago, I situate these stories as forms of Indigenous futurity. Why? Because for so long, our cultures and our language were seen as primitive, or even when they were given equal weight as just as advanced or just as sophisticated as Western cultures, we still were seen stuck in a particular place and time, and not belonging to a certain future imagined by settler society. And so I argue in a lot of my work, but also in this text, that Simon was really situating Potawatomi futurity by making sure that these stories were published and passed on to future generations. And because I enjoy artwork and science fiction, I actually, in a lot of my work, publish about Indigenous science fiction. I came across this birch bark piece that incorporates a sort of Boba Fett and Mandalorian. So if you're a Star Wars fan, you'll see the sort of blending of pop culture or science fiction through Star Wars with the traditional media of birch bark books, which is the topic of this conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in to my virtual lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is morseaub@msu.edu. That's morseaub@msu.edu. You can also check out some of my papers and my artwork on my website, which is just blairemorseau.com.